This is Mrs. Schultz, and in this video, I'm going to give you an introduction to the Protestant Reformation, which is, I think, a little bit easier to listen about than it is to read about because it can be a little bit confusing. But the Protestant Reformation officially began on October 31st, 1517. We'll come back to that date. It started in a time in late medieval Europe when nobody questioned the Christian church, specifically the Catholic Church, which had a lot of power in Europe at the time. There was a lot of cooperation between the church and the state, meaning the Pope and the leaders. The monarchies in different European countries often cooperated in corrupt ways. They didn't always get along or like each other, but they had uses for each other. And the church was very corrupt. As the power and size of the church grew, so did corruption and extravagance. The Catholic priests and, of course, the Pope were technically not allowed to marry. They weren't allowed to have relations with the other gender. We'll just call them relations. But there were some incredibly corrupt popes who did all of those things. They took bribes. They built lavish churches and homes, all while taking money from people who contributed to the church, and we'll come back to how they did that. Many thought that the church needed to return to its more humble roots and be more of a servant to the people. Instead, they heavily taxed peasants and farmers. They funded Renaissance works of art and their lavish lifestyles. Some of the early reformers, or people who felt like the church needed to change, were John Wycliffe, who believed the church should give up all possessions, and as a consequence, he was removed from his teaching job. Also, someone named Jan Hus, who thought the church was too concerned with money, and he spoke out against the church. He was arrested, tried for heresy, which is speaking against the church, and eventually burned at the stake. So the church didn't like their critics. The Pope during this time period was Pope Leo X, and he was building St. Peter's Basilica. Here's a picture of it in Rome. It's where the Vatican is located, and he needed extra money to finance it. In order to do this, he came up with something called indulgences, and he collected money from poor people around Europe in order to pay for his church, and then other priests collected money for indulgences for their own corrupt purposes. But what they told people is that when your relative or your loved one dies, they go to this in-between world. We call it purgatory, and they can't be released from purgatory to go up to heaven unless you pay a certain amount of money for them to be released. And the money was in the form of, they called this indulgences. So if you paid your local priest or if you paid the Pope money, then you could guarantee your recently deceased loved one would be able to go to heaven. And of course, people at the time didn't question the church and the church's teachings very often. And so they believed this when their priest told them that this was what was going to happen. Not everybody believed it. It angered some people. Martin Luther was one of them. Not just indulgences, but he had other ideas about how the church should run. He was German. He was a German-born monk and had a good ability both as a writer and a speaker. He was disturbed by the sale of indulgences, but also by some other things that we'll talk about here. So on October 31st, on 1517, he nailed what we call his 95 Theses, or ideas that he wanted to debate with Catholic Church officials on the cathedral door of his church. He didn't intend to split the church. He just wanted the church to reform. He said the Pope was not the head of the church, that Jesus was the head of the church. He believed that Bible and church services should be held in the vernacular or in people's languages, not Latin. All church services were given in Latin, and the vast majority of people didn't speak Latin. Also, they couldn't read the Bible because it was often written in Latin. So the religion wasn't accessible to people. It was sort of given to them by the priests. And he felt like services should be given in people's local language so they could understand. And also so they could read the Bible. For his desire to debate the 95 issues, he was excommunicated by Pope Leo X, and he was called to defend his views at something they called the Diet of Worms. It looks like worms, it's pronounced Worms, and it's a city in Germany. A diet is like a meeting. In the face of the Inquisition, he stood firm. He said, "Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me." And there was a movie made about this a few years ago. Here's a video link to the movie right here. If you're interested in stopping, you can watch it. It's just like 2 or 3 minutes, and it's the clip where he defends his view at the Diet. There was another reformer. He's pretty famous in the United States because his followers became over as the Pilgrims. His name is John Calvin. He was educated in France and influenced by Northern Renaissance writers like Erasmus. He preached the doctrine of predestination, which says that all our lives are predestined already, that God has already laid out the plan for our lives, and there's not much we can do to change what has already been decided for us. He also believed that people were sinful by nature, mandated church attendance. Everybody had to go. You weren't allowed to feast, to dance, to sing, or to wear jewelry. But the followers had a sense of mission and discipline, and they felt they were setting an example for others. And this sect or branch of Protestantism is like I said, these are the group of people who came to the New World as the Pilgrims. And eventually, we would have the Salem witch trials also from this sect of people. After the Reformation occurred and there was a split, this new church formed, the Protestant Church, that now has many, many denominations, over 100 denominations. I grew up Methodist, and Methodist is a denomination of Protestantism. In the main idea of the Counter-Reformation, which was the Catholic response to the Reformation, was they acknowledged that there was some need for reform. So they wanted to not admit they were wrong, but also change their church a little bit. And through this Counter-Reformation, they were able to gain more followers of Catholicism again. But there was no turning back. The Catholic Church was split in two now, and this new religion came out of it. There was something called the Council of Trent, which was part of the Counter-Reformation as part of the reforms. It was called by Pope Paul III, and it was kind of their answer to the Protestant objections. The sale of indulgences was abolished at this council, but there was no reconciliation between the two. Afterwards, the Roman Inquisition, which was led by the Catholic Church, started to hunt down Protestants, also people they accused of being witches and people breaking church law. In the Spanish Inquisition, they persecuted and converted Jews and Muslims in Spain, and if they refused to convert to Christianity, they forced them to leave. They also banned books because of their corrupting influence on people's souls, and they forced Jews to live in ghettos, which were a separate part of the city. We see this again during the Holocaust under Adolf Hitler. Jews living in ghettos before they're transported to concentration camps. And they did keep them in at night by closing the gates. So this is from page 460 in your textbook. Causes of the Reformation. These humanist values that led people to question church authority. Some clergy were corrupt. Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses, and then the printing press, which was also invented about the same time, which could print books quickly instead of having monks write them out by hand, helped to spread Reformation ideas. Many Protestant sects developed. This was the effects. Church leaders reformed the Catholic Church. Religious intolerance and anti-Semitism increased in Europe as the Catholics rebelled against this new religion, and religious conflict spread across Europe. Okay, so fill in your notes for this if you're filling out notes, and turn those in when you're done, and let me know if you have any questions.